Israel became slaves because they chose to stay in Egypt. It seems to me that they stayed because long before they became slaves to the Egyptians, they became slaves to the culture. They became slaves to their possessions. As I was reflecting on this coming year and listening to hear what direction the Spirit was leading for our teaching, I felt it would be good to begin this new year with a series of messages to help us to know how to disengage from the chaos that seems to surround us right now. This message is the first in a series that I'm calling Resistance. I believe that God has designed a way of life that if we would understand and receive it, it would disrupt the influence of the world around us and allow us to live a fuller and more peaceful life, even while the world around us seems to be falling apart. I think that we were all hoping that 2021 would offer us some reprieve from the persistent onslaught of stress and anxiety, turmoil and conflict that we experienced throughout 2020. It's been incredibly hard lately to disconnect from the constant flow of troubles in the world. There's a pervasive driving force in our society that's pushing us to get more and to have more and to do more. It starts with our desire to meet our basic daily needs and put food on the table, clothes on our back, a roof over our heads, but somehow we get pressed beyond just our basic necessities into rampant excess. Every day we're bombarded with over 5,000 messages from companies selling us on how their product or service is essential to our health and happiness. It's the reason we're so rarely content with the things that we have and feel a consistent need to have something newer, something better. We're constantly encouraged to buy new cars, new clothes, new houses, new phones, shoes, TVs, computers, whatever it is. Movies are a good example of this cultural phenomenon. When DVDs came out, people started upgrading and buying all the movies they already had that were on VHS, and now they're buying them on DVD. And then the same thing happened when we transitioned to Blu-ray, and again when we went to streaming. We went out, we rebought the same exact movies in different formats because they were the newest thing and we felt like we had to have them. And I'm as guilty as anyone. I constantly struggle with my desire to have some new gadget or gizmo. And I'm trying, I'm getting better at resisting the pressure to get the new thing, but I still fall victim to this persistent narrative that tells me that I need something new, something different. The world around us, it's an expert at convincing us that our wants are our needs and that we have to have whatever the thing is. And if you're willing to work hard enough or long enough, you can have everything you desire and then you'll be happy. But this mentality, it's a cruel taskmaster. If we fall victim to it, more is never enough. Our needs only increase. We find ourselves sacrificing more and more of the things that matter. The primary sacrifice being our time with our families, time alone with ourselves, time alone with God. We run ourselves ragged trying to get everything that we want, and then once we have it, we find out that it wasn't enough. And we've been spending our lives driven to and fro by the influence of the world, and now we have this global pandemic, racial unrest, political conflict, and suddenly it's no longer just a matter of working hard and then we'll get what we want. There's a very real question of if we're going to be able to get the things that we feel that we want or need. As this additional stimulus is added to the slew of messages we take in every day, our stress levels are just going up and up and up. Fear is overtaking us. Decency is breaking down. Selfishness is running rampant in the world. It has been for some time, but now it's becoming an epidemic. Sometimes our selfishness is subtle, other times not so much. But one thing seems to be crystal clear. Our society has become consumed with getting our way, having exactly what I want, what I think I need, and when it comes to me and my family, we come first. If I have to step on other people to get what we want, then so be it. The things that I need or want may not always be available to me, and so I have to get them right now while they're available. This is why when the pandemic first hit and the supply chain began to feel some strain, it was perceived that we were running out of toilet paper. everyone rushed out and bought more toilet paper. If people had just stopped for a moment, evaluated their situation, and realized that, hey, I have enough toilet paper to last me for a couple of months. I don't need to go out and buy another big, huge package of toilet paper right now. Then there probably would have been enough toilet paper in the supply chain to get us down the road till it could adapt to the new circumstances, which is exactly what it did. But for a good few weeks, most of us were experiencing an increase in our anxiety and a decrease in our concern for the well-being of others because we were worried that we were about to run out of toilet paper. And I'm not going to go down this road and make a bunch of other examples about how this works in other areas of life, but if you look at what's going on in the world around us and really listen to the messages you're hearing, regardless of your political persuasion, your racial identity, or your perspective on the pandemic, what is driving this escalation of conflict and demonstration we're seeing is a fear that someone or something is coming to take away something valuable to us. We begin to worry about the future, if we're going to be able to continue in our accustomed way of life. But here's the question that we really need to be asking ourselves. Do we even want to continue in our accustomed way of life? Is this life that I've been pursuing the life that I really want? Is it the life that God would want for me? Are my priorities straight here? And this is the point where most honest-hearted Christians, we're going to have to acknowledge that there are a great deal of things in our lives that don't really align with the life that the Bible calls us to. Much of our lives don't really look a whole lot like the life that Jesus lived. The influence of the world around us, it's overwhelmed us, and we're being carried away by a tide of selfishness, consumerism, politics, and anxiety. And rather than finding a hope in Jesus that disconnects that influence, we're allowing it to erode away the very foundations of our faith. So, how do we fix this? How do we resist the pressure to go along with the world around us? Think about a dam. Most of us have probably seen the Hoover Dam. So imagine in your mind for just a minute the Hoover Dam. A dam is meant to resist the pressure of the water behind it so that the amount of water that passes through the dam is manageable. If you close the dam off completely, eventually the water behind it is going to build up and burst the dam or flow around it and erode it away. If you remove the dam completely, then towns and fields downstream will not be able to hold up against the massive flow of water that's going to come their way. The dam's job is to offer resistance. Resistance to the pressure of the water so that it flows out of the other side in a way that can be maintained downstream. I believe that God has placed an object of resistance in creation to decrease the flow of the world's influence on us so that we can resist that pressure to conform that is being placed on us. A way to keep from being carried away by the rushing tides of politics, consumerism, selfishness, and fear. In the story of the Exodus, we find that the overarching narrative of the entire Bible is actually played out through this one event. You have the story of competing cultural systems and the deities that rule them. You have on one side the culture of the kingdom of heaven ruled by the Creator God. And he's seeking to liberate his people from the worldly kingdom of Egypt that's ruled by Pharaoh. The Israelites, they were slaves to this worldly kingdom, and in that, there's enough to understand the main thrust of the Exodus. Yahweh, the Creator God, is a liberator. For 400 years, Israel had been in Egypt, but they were not captured and forced into slavery. To understand how they became slaves, we need to go back to the story of Joseph. And in this story, we find the beginning of Egypt's historical national identity from this time. And we can begin to understand how it came to be that an entire nation was enslaved to them. Egypt was already a significant kingdom when we come to it at the end of Genesis. In the closing chapters of this first book of the Bible, we find a story of a Pharaoh. He has a dream that he doesn't really understand, but it gives him great anxiety. And so God sends Joseph to interpret that dream. The dream, it was a message from God to Pharaoh. A famine was coming on the world, and God was setting Egypt up to be the provider for the world. Rather than face destruction, Egypt would become even greater and more powerful than ever before. For 7 years, Egypt, under the leadership of Joseph, prepared for this famine, stockpiling grain and supplies. They built storehouses to hold all the provisions that they were storing up. And when the famine began, they were ready to provide food to those in need. And people came from all around to buy grain from Egypt. They had to survive, and so they came bearing their most precious treasures to trade for the food they needed. Egypt became extremely wealthy as a result of God's intervention. But they seem to have not really held on to the fact that it was this God who intervened that provided this wealth for them. What we find in the archaeological record is more of ancient Egypt's culture is unearthed is that they were a culture of incredible wealth. They had so much that their rulers would be buried with their treasures. That's what the pyramids are, massive tombs that contain the wealth and the treasures with the rulers. They didn't just have storehouses, they had store cities. They went through a period of incredible expansion and acquisition, and it seems, as we fast forward some 400 years, that the expansion and hoarding ultimately led to the enslavement of the children of Israel. We aren't given a clear record of how the Israelites went from guests to slaves in Scripture, but as I observe the power of the world's influence on the church today, I have a theory of how it happened. The famine, it lasted 7 years. I don't know how long after it began that the tribe of Israel moved to Egypt, but even if it was in the first year, which is probably unlikely, that means if you allow for some time for the land to recover from the famine, they really only needed to stay in Egypt for 10, maybe 15 years, but they stayed much longer than that. For at least a generation. They could have left at any time, as long as Joseph was alive, and probably for some time after that, as his memory was still vivid in the minds of the Egyptians. I imagine that his people could have packed up and moved back to Canaan unresisted, but they stayed. Israel became slaves because they chose to stay in Egypt, to not return to their true inheritance. So the people who were responsible for the preservation of Egypt through the work of Joseph eventually became the slaves that were used to maintain the lifestyle that the Egyptians had grown accustomed to. I would suggest that the Israelites stayed because they too grew accustomed to the lifestyle of Egypt. While they were sojourning in this land for survival, they let the culture rub off on them. They built homes, they made friends, they planted fields. And if they were to go back to their inheritance, they would have to start over, leave behind all that they had worked for. It seems to me that they stayed because long before they became slaves to the Egyptians, they became slaves to the culture. They became slaves to their possessions. And we find in Exodus 5 a story that demonstrates the mentality of that culture, a mentality that demands more. Here in Exodus 5, we find the first account of Moses interacting with Pharaoh. Moses had already met with the people. He told them that God was about to deliver them. And it seems that Moses had also begun to remind the people about the true worship of God. You're probably somewhat familiar with this story. It's the story of the bricks without straw. In response to Moses' exchange with the Pharaoh, he gives a command to the Israelites that they should no longer be given any straw to make their bricks with, but that they still had to make their quotas. On the surface, this seems petty and counterproductive for the Pharaoh to make this command, but there's something sitting just below the surface of this story that's worth noticing. After Moses makes his request to the Pharaoh that he allow the people to go into the wilderness to worship their God, this is Pharaoh's reply. Exodus chapter 5, beginning in verse 4. But the king of Egypt said to them, Moses and Aaron, why do you take the people away from their work? Get back to your burdens. And Pharaoh said, behold, the people of the land are now many, and you make them rest from their burdens. The Pharaoh makes a charge against Moses. And that charge is that he made the people to rest. In the Hebrew, that word rest means to observe the Sabbath. One of the first things that Moses calls the people to do when he gets back to Egypt is to start Sabbathing. It's been 400 years. The Israelites have been slaves for generations. Slaves don't get to set their own schedule. They really don't have any control of their lives at all. They've been integrated into an Egyptian culture, and it's safe to assume that their religion now looks like the Egyptian religion. And the first thing that God does to reestablish his connection with his people is to call them to Sabbath. And this is significant for two reasons. First, it's a direct attack on the sovereignty of Pharaoh. As we can see, the Pharaoh's response is not one of an all-powerful deity. He comes right out and says it. The people are many, and you make them break from my control over their lives. He feared that if the people began ordering their lives in a new way, that he would lose his control over them. The Israelite slaves, they were essential for Egyptian culture. They were the means by which the kingdom continued to expand, to build. It seems that even when resting from their work, though, that they had still been making their quotas. And so the response of the ruler is to require more. If you have time to rest, you have time to do more. Second, it presented the children of Israel with a picture of a God that stands in direct contradiction to the rule of the one who had claimed to be their God for so long. It drew the battle lines between the two powers who claimed authority over the world. One who demanded complete submission and required that you submit all of your strength and energy to providing for him, and one who offers rest. One who breaks the cycle of abuse and oppression. One who offers each person the right to be valued. In God's order of things, the Sabbath offers us a method of resistance that protects us from the overwhelming power and influence of the world around us. It becomes the valve that keeps us from being swept away by the persistent pressure to build up storehouses and amass wealth and goods. It breaks the cycle of excess that dehumanizes us and creates a culture that values possessions over people. In Egypt, the Israelites had been subject to what seems to be a never-ending cycle of work. One day bled into the other. Weeks became a blur. There was no rest, no breaks in the persistent push of work. Every day they had a task to complete, and their survival depended on it. 7 days a week, 365 days a year, they worked to survive. Slaves to a culture that valued them only for what they could produce. Their entire lives spent to serve their taskmasters, masters who only took from them. But now, as they look back across the Red Sea, a new era is dawning for this people, an era of freedom. Their masters have been overthrown by a new ruler. The kingdom of Egypt is behind them forever, and they are led towards their new homes. Here in the wilderness, their new God begins to reveal to them a new way of life. He demonstrates that he will make himself responsible for the provision of the people. He is a ruler that does not take from his people, but gives. He begins to rain manna down from heaven so that the people have food to eat every day. But the rules of this food, they're somewhat curious. Each day, the people are to go out and collect only enough food for that day, just enough to feed their families. If they collect more than they need, by the next day, it's rotted. Except on the sixth day. On that day, they are to collect a double portion, so that on the seventh day, they can rest. They can take a day off. They're now living in a new kingdom under the rule of a new God. This God provides for them. He gives them what they need day in and day out. And the people no longer live in a culture that thrives in excess, that stores up more than they need. The Creator God is a God who knows that more is not always better, that enough really is enough, and that there are some things that are more important than what we possess or even the food we eat. At creation, God worked for 6 days and created everything he wanted to create. And then he stopped on the seventh day so that he, along with his most treasured creations, Adam and Eve, they could enjoy what he had created for them. This God is a God who values work, but understands that work is only valuable if we can share it with others. And so now, as we stand at the base of Mount Sinai, God has liberated his people. He has demonstrated that he will provide for them. And it is here at this mountain that God will establish his covenant with the people. It is here that he will lay out what it is to live under his authority as their God. He is about to give them the 10 Commandments. He says to them in Exodus chapter 20, beginning in verse 2, I am the Lord your God who brought you out of the land of Egypt, out of the house of slavery. You shall have no other gods before me. You shall not make for yourself a carved image or any likeness of anything that is in heaven above or that is in earth beneath or that is in the water under the earth. You shall not bow down to them or serve them, for I, the Lord your God, am a jealous God. You shall not take the name of the Lord your God in vain. All things being equal, these first 3 commands sound an awful lot like something you would hear from just about any God. Sounds an awful lot like what they would have been hearing from Pharaoh as he extracted every last drop of work from them that he could. Sounds like the same single-minded devotion that the gods of our world today require from us. You want to succeed? You have to give me everything that you have. You want to be rich, famous, powerful? Then you're going to have to think of nothing else but your goal. You can't hold on to anything. You can't keep anything back. You have to work hard and you have to work long. If you want to have all of your dreams come true, you have to commit to it. You can have that house, that car, those vacations, those gadgets. You can live the life that you dream of, if you will just work hard enough. Put in the effort and you can have it all. But like the Egyptians of old, the kingdom that rules our culture today will never be satisfied with enough. You achieve your goal, good. But look at the other things that are out there now, the newer, better, faster things. You got a new car? Well, this one's fancier. You finally bought a house? But is it this nice inside? Oh, you got that promotion at work? Good. Actually, you could make more money if you went for this other position. Now look, there's nothing wrong with working hard to get a new house, to have a new car, to take a vacation, to make more money. It was God himself that provided for Egypt to become the storehouse of the world, to acquire wealth and influence. The difficulty is that if we're not careful, we, like Egypt, can become all consumed by the pursuit of the bigger, better thing. The world would have us never be content with what we have, to be always seeking to get something more. And we know this is true. In every generation, the worst atrocities have been committed by people consumed with amassing wealth and power. People who are never content with enough. Our world today, it's littered with broken families and shattered dreams, all left in the wake of a never-ending pursuit of more. The kingdom of heaven, like any kingdom, it requires full surrender to its ruler. But there's something different about God's kingdom. After declaring that devotion is required of the people, God issues another commandment, the 4th commandment. It's in Exodus chapter 20, verses 8 through 11. It says, "Remember the Sabbath day to keep it holy. 6 days you shall labor and do all of your work, but the 7th day is a Sabbath to the Lord your God. On it you shall not do any work, you or your son or your daughter, your male servant or your female servant, or your livestock, or the sojourner who's within your gates. For in 6 days the Lord made heaven and earth, the sea, and all that is in them, and rested on the 7th day. Therefore the Lord blessed the Sabbath day and made it holy." This God, unlike the people's previous ruler, does not require never-ending work to provide for his selfish desires. This God is the creator who made everything that humanity needed for life and for their happiness, and then he gave it to them to enjoy. He's the one who will provide for them. They don't have to work endlessly anymore. They can stop and rest. This is how God designed for us to resist the ever-pressing influence of the world around us, to work more, to get more, so that we can have extra. There's this ever-present feeling that happiness is found in excess. The Creator God calls us to a weekly rhythm of rest. One day every 7 days, we should stop working, set the day apart as different from the others, interrupt the flow of our daily lives, and celebrate with our Creator the things that He has provided for us and the things that we have gained by our 6 days of work. God calls us to Sabbath. It is the quintessential expression of the religion of the one true God. Once a week, God designed that we would stop all of our work, that we would stop worrying about how we're going to provide for ourselves, how we're going to get enough food, to get enough gas, to quit worrying about getting more and just enjoy what we have. Once every 7 days, God's prescription for life and worship is to rest in what He has provided for us. Sabbath is resistance. It's resistance against the never-ending cycle of anxiety driven by our inclination to work without rest. Sabbath frees us from the fear that we don't have enough, that our needs may not be met. Sabbath is a way we disconnect from the daily rat race and learn to appreciate all that God has given us, to stop long enough to realize that we already have enough, that God has already blessed us with all that we need. It sure looks like 2021 will be a year that just keeps us in a state of unrest for at least a little while longer. The pandemic is still going strong. The political climate is as tense as ever. We all have questions about how we're going to make it through this. Will we have a job next month? Are we going to be able to buy groceries? Will I be able to see my family and friends again? When is life going to go back to normal? These are big questions. 6 days a week, we work. We do the best we can to provide for our families, to plan for the future, to be prepared to make it through this uncertainty that we're living in right now. But on the seventh day, God invites us to rest, to resist the urge to worry about the future and to let go of the past, to come apart and enter into the peace that comes from laying down our burdens, even if it's only for just a few short hours. This is God's plan for us to resist the world's influence. I invite you to join this resistance. I invite you to Sabbath.